I recently watched a video on the Linux Cast YouTube channel whereby the person there reviewed the configuration for ArcoLinux, specifically for Fvwm3. And as I was watching that video, I noticed a number of things that didn't seem quite right, or indeed perhaps seemed external to the window manager itself. And I thought I'd take a look now to see what they've configured the default settings to be and whether or not we can improve on that. So what you see in front of you here is largely what you would see out of the box, except that I don't have a number of external programs that would be running at this point. So I believe that Conky would probably be here on the right hand side showing a list of things, and if you have it installed, something like Polybar could run on the top to give you some information about the state of the system or indeed the applications that you have open. Neither of those applications are actually needed to get that information. However, there's nothing stopping you from using them if that is indeed your choice. Certainly for most of that, Fvwm does have its own modules that can be used for similar effect. So this is the default configuration file that ArcoLinux have configured, and it is based on the default. The first interesting point that I can see here is there is a huge amount of setenv commands to set various environment variables to hold program information from the looks of it. And what's interesting about this is really they should be using InfoStore for this, because I don't believe that any of these environment variables propagate externally from this window manager. So it is a polluting effect that probably doesn't need to happen. And the first thing that leaps out at me is this environment here for Fvwm home. Now I've changed this so that I can actually run this configuration file, but it is set to $home.fvwm by default, and actually Fvwm already sets this in the environment. It comes in the form of this. So almost immediately we can get rid of this environment variable, and indeed Fvwm is clever enough to use that path by default when it is loading up certain things. So I think what I'll do is I will annotate and or amend this configuration file to make it more Fvwm specific, if you like, idiomatic almost, and I will probably then submit this as a patch to ArcoLinux that they can include it in the next version of their release, because I think there are a number of things here that could benefit from a second pair of eyes. So we'll come back to this in a bit as we go. Okay, so we're using classic and setenv icons. Again, that's not necessarily needed, because when it comes to the image path here, that will look wherever we tell it to, and by default it's going to be looking under fvwm userdir anyway. And we can probably streamline this a little bit. So all these icons, launchers, backgrounds, they all use this images property, and that inherits from, well, it should be this. So actually we can shorten this a little bit. So now, because we know that we're looking in the default place, we can actually get rid of this, and images themselves are now relative to fvwm userdir, so we don't need to specify that. Themes likewise And so wherever we have $fvwm home, we can just get rid of that, and fvwm images now is just a subdirectory, and because we're setting backgrounds here as a part of that, we could, if you wanted to, just append to this wholesale without creating an environment variable. I don't think this is used elsewhere. No, it's not. Launchers isn't, and icons possibly will be. No, it's not. So actually, we could get rid of all of these environment variables and just hard code them, and there'd be nothing wrong with that. So let's do that. So comment that out. Use it as a reference. We can say image path here, because it's relative to here. We just need to say icons. And we don't need the trailing slash, but there's nothing wrong in keeping it there. Launchers. Oops. Backgrounds. And that plus symbol at the end is just appending the previous definition, which is set by default by fvwm itself. So we can now say goodbye to that, to that, to that. This is no longer being used anywhere specifically. Themes doesn't seem to be used at all, so that can go. And because we're reading this relative to everything else, images can go. We can just have that like that. We can get rid of that. The icons isn't being used, and the window icons are being used here. Okay, fair enough. I would ultimately convert that to info store anyway. Pictures home doesn't seem to be used, so you can get rid of that. And I'll make a quick note here. Convert to info store so I don't forget. Well, interestingly enough, you can tell that there's not been too much thought around using this. It's more a case of someone sort of shoehorned in a bunch of stuff to make it work, considering that the comment here about start function explains how you're meant to use it, and right below it that's been ignored almost, and we just have a dumping ground of a whole bunch of stuff that gets started. Now the problem in doing it like this is there is no control over when these applications are started, if that is indeed something that you actually want. And also you can see here that we have two execs and ampersands at the end. So the first exec here is actually a command to fvwm to say that we're actually going to be executing a shell or a program, and in doing that, because it runs via binsh, what you don't want to do is to have your command after it look like this. Because what that would do is this here would leave a dangling shell behind, because we are running that command through binsh. So the second exec is actually at the shell level to kick the the shell we spawn to run that command out of the way and just leave that xterm running. So this is actually correct, and that's idiomatic typically of how you would spawn external programs. The problem here is that because you are execing and you're not hanging about, there is absolutely no need to then further background any of these applications, because they are inherently already being backgrounded. There is no job control happening here at all. So none of these ampersands need to be here whatsoever. Also, if this file is ever read in more than once, then these exec commands would be executed time and again, which is why you'd probably want to tie them to the start function as well. So some of these are probably only intended to be run at startup, and presumably this has been done like this because trying to tie this into a display manager, if indeed one is being used, is harder, because different display managers will actually read different files. In the good old days of just using XDM, the typical file that you would tend to put a lot of these applications in would have been your .xsessions file, but fair enough that someone's actually tried to do it here. So since you'd want to have these run at init time, i.e. when fvwm is starting up, and only at init time, one thing we can do is just wrap these commands around a condition such as that. So we can create a function such as, well, let's do it. Let's say we call it run progs or something like that. And whenever we create a new function, we always go through this preamble of destroying it first and then creating it again brand new, because add to func is additive in terms of creating it and adding to it. So you destroy it first so that it's obvious and clear that this is the actual definition of the function that you intend people to add to. And so now I can make all of these a member of this function. To do that, I just need to add at the beginning here a condition. So all I need to do now is add these to the function itself. So now we just need to call this function from start function. And it doesn't matter where we add it in, because the test condition will do the hard work for us. So that tidies things up a little bit. Whilst I'm here, I'll remove these ampersands as well. It's interesting that they've got some slop in here, so I'm going to just sort of tidy that up. It does also seem to me, particularly if you're using this window manager, that you probably wouldn't want half of XFCE. I'm not quite sure why they're bothering with the power manager here, or indeed the notify daemon, when things like dunst would do just as well, and therefore there's no dependency, if you like, on installing XFCE, but presumably ArcoLinux seems to have that installed out of the box, or indeed a dependency on this. So fair enough if that is how that's supposed to work. And again here, this last line is interesting because we're execing sleep 2 and backgrounding it, and then we're supposed to be starting this variety command, whatever that does, and then background that. The problem here is that sleep is not an external program, it's actually a shell built in, so I don't know what this is actually achieving, but that sleep certainly won't do anything, and there's certainly no need to background variety either, so that this whole thing can just be boiled down to variety, because that would never have worked in the way that it was listed there. Okay, moving on. One thing to note actually before I move on is this line here. On line 110 you can see that they're using the shared X hotkey daemon, which is an external program that allows you to define key bindings. That's fine, you're free to use that if you have bindings that are sort of common across different window managers that you intend to use. However, it does take away a lot of the functionality that fvwm has built into it, and when I was talking through the default configuration, and we'll probably see it again in here, we are able to have richer bindings if we define them within the fvwm configuration file itself, such as binding to the title bar, the sides of the window, the handles. You can even have Windows specific key bindings that only work if you happen to have, say, Xterm or URXVT focused. You're not able to do that if you're defining your key bindings just within something like this, because that's an external application that has absolutely no awareness or understanding of the environment that the bindings should be running. So that's worth bearing in mind. So toggle title, I've actually changed this recently in Git, but it hasn't been released yet. That will come out in the 1.0.4 release. But I added a has title condition to 1.0.3, and therefore we can simplify this function greatly by just testing to see if the window has a title, and if it does, hide it; if it doesn't, show it. But this is fine, it's functional, I'll leave it there for now. Change desk, I don't think that's going to be used because they're not using the standard right panel, so this function is going to be doing nothing. Okay, the diagram here for desktops and pages doesn't actually portray the actual desktop size because this diagram shows 2 by 2, but actually they've set 3 by 3. So let's fix that. It's possibly a minor thing, but yeah, you should probably try and keep the documentation and changes up to date as best you can. So this EWMH activate window func is a function that you can define as this the case here, and I think what I'm looking at is actually the default internal to fvwm, but it's run whenever a application that's extended window manager hints aware wants your attention. So that might be because a certain condition means that the user needs to interact with the window, such as a long running process is finished and the application says I'm done. It might be because of urgency and therefore it's demanding the user's attention, but this is the function that runs when such a window is in that state. And so here you can see that we de-iconify the window if indeed it's iconified. We focus, we raise it, and we actually move the mouse pointer into the window itself, which is quite useful. So none of this has changed from the default, I can tell. The colours certainly have, and the colour sets themselves look as though they have changed slightly. I'm going to skip most of this because that's the default. Interestingly enough, because the desktop size has changed, this menu needs to be expanded to include the additional pages now that are available. So I'm just going to add a to do here. So they've commented out the man page menu. Presumably nobody wants to read the documentation. That explains a lot. Go to desks. There's 3 desks, and that's true because I believe the pager here is 3 desks. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so they've changed this to include icons for buttons. That's fine. Presumably if I have an unfocused window, that's just going to default to the MWM style here. Yes, it does. Yeah, okay. That could probably be improved actually. I suspect that there wasn't much thought put into that, but that should probably be improved to make it a little more user friendly, particularly if you're not familiar with what those buttons are for unfocused windows. So if the right panel definition can remain here, it's not being used, neither is this. The new desk condition won't do anything because that's only useful if the right panel is being displayed, but it doesn't do any harm to leave it in. So Windows key and arrow keys move to the next desktop in the desired direction. Does it? So if I hold down Windows key and Alt, yeah, okay, that seems to do the right thing. So these key bindings here, these should maximize vertically, horizontally, and F is supposed to say no title or borders. However, that probably isn't doing what they meant it to do. It's highly likely that probably maximize full screen is what was meant here, and that will actually toggle anyway. So we can improve that a little bit actually. So left, right, up, down, where we press Control Meta will actually move the pages, not desks. If I do that, you've probably seen the lower left corner, I'm moving around all the pages like that. Happy days, yeah. It's good. If I do 1, 2 and 3, yeah, that switches between desks. Windows key and left, right, up and down is meant to call this snap left, right, half, quarter, tiny, but that isn't actually used anywhere. So that will need fixing. Okay, it's fairly standard stuff. And then the rest of it is, there's a launcher's button definition here. But it's commented out by default why that would be the case, and why indeed they haven't stuck with the right panel, I don't know. So yes, it's an interesting take on the default configuration. There has been some attempts to presumably try and make the experience in using this consistent across other window managers, and I suspect that's true because of this swathe of external stuff that is loaded as part of the window manager itself. That's no bad thing, you know, and consistency is absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But it's by no means showcasing what you can do with this window manager. But again, you know, I'm not surprised to see it configured in this way, because it is a very personal thing in terms of trying to set up workflows. So I think they have done a good enough job, but this is certainly going to confuse, I think, a lot of people, because again, there's very little in the way of help that's given to the user, even in the use of these external programs. So I'm going to go ahead and submit a patch against the repository, and whilst I'm there, I'm just going to inquire as to the intent of what these missing functions were supposed to do, and I'll probably help the ArcoLinux team define them, and whilst I'm there, I'll probably see if there's any additional functionality that I can add in to make things a little bit easier for them. So that was a really interesting look at what ArcoLinux have been doing. Do go and check out the video from the Linux cast. I'll link to the description below. Thanks for watching. Cheers.